I did use both sides of the paper where possible, yes. Are people still coming in? Michelle, are you coming? Yes, I am. I just wondered if you were coming back. I just want to make sure everybody has a packet if they're here, if they would like one anyway. There's enough. If people want to, if those who are in couples would like one in front of them, if you can turn it back in if you want when you're done. But you can, for now, you're sitting in different seats. So. You're welcome. All right. It'll cool off by the time I'm done, probably. All right.
Welcome.
Thank you.
I hope you all can hear me. I'm Jean Schnurl from the Horizon class, and this is a joint venture with the Horizon class and the Corinthian class and others who came to church today who are joining us here in the sanctuary and those who are joining us by live streaming. Did you notice that the ushers today had white flowers? That was in honor of the new year, 2022. And 2022 is filled with a faith journey for all the people here. Faith journey that you can extend yourself, either by learning for yourself or sharing with others what you can do. So many things are coming and happening at this church, and this is one of the things that we are starting with. Pastor Matt has started the Matthew study, a Bible study. And this is a study today of what the structure of our church is. What is the hierarchy? Who makes decisions? How are they made? But I would like to have you join with me in a New Year's prayer, because that wonderful God has so much in store for all of us. Let us pray. Wonderful God, thank you for new beginnings. What an incredible time this is, with a fresh year's potential stretched out in front of us. We want to be found faithful this year in each and every opportunity that you bring to us. Thank you for all the blessings you give us, even those we don't recognize at the time. Amen.
Amen.
And as we start the new year, Pastor Matt is here with our program today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. Okay, does anybody not have a folder who would like to have one? Again, I apologize for the amount of paper that there is in here, but and you're not required to read it all, but for those of you who do want to read it, it's all there for you. I just want to go through. If you start from the end that says Council of Bishops, it should be the first thing on your pile. This is a recent letter from the Council of Bishops on the situation of the United Methodist Church as it is today. So you can read that. We'll go through some of that later. The second pack that's in there says just the basics at the top. This I wrote for confirmation class for 7th graders. It's everything you need to know about the United Methodist Church in 5 pages, and we'll be using some of that. Following that is a chart, is a graphic depiction of what has happened to the original Methodist Episcopal Church in America since 1784. We're worried about splitting our church now. This shows how many. This is on the end at the top where it says Christian Advocate. That's where we started, and you can see all the various splits and reconfigurations there have been through the years in the Methodist movement. This is a timeline of Methodism, may be of interest to you. The next one says Theology of UMC at the top of it. That is from, I think this one is from the 2012 discipline, but it's the, well, it has the nature, design, and general rules of the United Methodist Church, but it also has our theological task in it. Again, it's reading for later. The next is the big packet. This is the social principles as they appeared in the discipline of 2016. And again, we'll be going through that. Following that is the summary and frequently asked questions, FAQs, about the proposed legislation that will enable a separation of the United Methodist Church. They call it reconciliation and grace through separation and restructuring. So the actual proposed legislation is the next packet after the FAQs. And finally, the last single sheet of paper is frequently asked questions about the global Methodist Church, which is it's the biggest and most organized of the proposed traditionalist Methodist churches that may come out of this separation. I wanted to give you some exposure to that, and we'll talk about various parts of this. Any questions so far? All right, you're sure? You may ask a question anytime. No question is out of line. If I don't know the answer, I will tell you I don't know the answer. Okay? Ground rules, okay? I'd like us to turn to just the basics. Now, this, you can't really talk about the United Methodist Church without some background on where we came from. Who we are and how we do things is partly based on where we came from. So in just the basics, let's turn to the bottom of the second page where it says about the United Methodist Church. You basically know about where the church itself came from. You've heard of Jesus, probably. Okay. We grew out of the Jewish expression of faith in the one true and living God, and Christianity has proceeded its way through and up to the Church of England, which was created out of personal and political necessity by King Henry VIII of England. It was really the Catholic Church in England, but it became the Church of England after they separated. John Wesley was raised in this Anglican, or the Church of England, also called the Anglican Church. And John Wesley was the son of a pastor, Samuel Wesley, and a very strong woman, Susanna Wesley, who was a great teacher, a lay teacher of people, gathered folks for prayer and fellowship, basically a church in her kitchen. Her husband was away for various reasons, including being arrested for non-payment of his debts. So she kind of held down the fort, and she often gathered the people of his parish for teaching. And she taught all of her, how many survived? 13, 14 of 20 children that she bore. Taught them all herself in a homeschooling kind of setting. They began reading by reading the Bible. So that was a part of the Wesleys' lives. John and Charles Wesley, the oldest, actually the second and third oldest sons in the family, went to the university at Oxford, and in their time there, they started a social group, social and ministry group, fellowship group, if you will, that they called the Holy Club, and that they set up for themselves a way of living their lives that was very regimented. And they got up early and they prayed at certain times, etc. Their friends, or maybe not so much friends, but people who knew them, began to mock them and their ways of doing things, their methods of doing things, and so they called them Methodists. It was originally it was a mocking term, just as Christian was a mocking term back in the early days of the Roman Empire, or the early days of Christianity in the Roman Empire. It was used as a derisive term. But John began to adopt that name and started referring, as the group grew and spread, he began to start referring to them as the people called Methodists. So that's where our name came from. It was a mocking term that was owned by John Wesley and Charles Wesley. Charles became quite the hymn writer. He wrote thousands of hymns, some of which are still in our hymnal. In this season of the year, we always think of "Hark the Herald Angels Sing" that he composed, that he wrote the poetry for. Methodism spread in England as a movement, as a fellowship kind of thing within the Church of England. It was a revival movement. But it was designed to be working within the Church of England. Wesley never left the Church of England. Eventually, he was ordained a priest after his years at Oxford. He became a priest in the Church of England. While he was already ordained, he had an experience of a religious experience, is the only way to really put it. He was listening in on a prayer meeting in Aldersgate Street, as the English say, in Aldersgate Street, and he was listening to a reading of Luther's commentary on the Romans, and all of a sudden, he felt that his heart was strangely warmed. He had an understanding that Christ had died not just for the whole world or for some nebulous everybody, but for him. He had a sense of personal salvation. And we refer to that as his Aldersgate experience. And he came to know God's grace. Grace was a big theme in John's later writings, in his journals, in his notes, in his sermons, all of which he preserved. And I have it's about this long on my bookshelf, the complete works of John Wesley. But he wrote down lots of stuff. He saved everything apparently, and passed it on. But that sense of God's grace being not just for everybody or for the whole world as an undivided whole, but for him, that was important. And he understood grace to come in stages to us, but that first of all, grace comes to us as an act of God. It's God's volition, God's choice to bestow grace on us. Before we know anything about God, before we understand anything about faith, before we know any of the scriptures, God's grace comes to us. He called it preventing grace, but by that he meant grace that comes before. We now use the term prevenient because preventing has changed its meaning in the intervening years. John spoke sort of King James English. He lived in the 1700s, and the use of words has changed. So now we call that prevenient grace, or grace that comes before, comes to us by God's choice. He then talks about saving grace, or salvific grace, or justifying grace, by which he means that we take God's grace that comes to us, we respond to God's grace. I like to think of it as, we're standing with our backs to God, and God taps us on the shoulders. That's prevenient grace. And then when we turn around and receive God's grace, receive the gift of God's grace, then we receive justification, or being put into right relationship with God. And that's justifying grace. It brings us into right relationship with God. And then Wesley understood that there was a third stage of grace, which is sanctifying grace. And that is the work of the Holy Spirit working in our lives day by day, making us more and more able to love as Jesus loved. It doesn't necessarily make us behave better. That's not the point. The point of sanctifying grace is God at work in our lives through the Holy Spirit, continuing to improve our ability to love as God loves the world, as Jesus loved the people of the world. This understanding of grace became the foundation of the Methodist movement. What John and Charles did was they took their experience at Oxford, this fellowship experience, and they tried to plant it in the various churches and communities of the Church of England. So they would have Methodist societies within the churches. And they would gather people in small groups. They divided the societies into classes. They divided the classes into bands of 4 or 5 people. And they prayed with one another. They asked each other, "How is it with your soul?" and held them to account about it. And the movement spread like crazy. John recruited preachers from among the lay people, and they went out from the churches, from these Methodist societies, and started preaching to people in the countryside, which was not officially allowed in the Anglican Church, and John got in some big trouble about it. But they went out, they went to the mines. They preached at the entrance to the mines where people were working 7 days a week, and they preached as they came to work and as they left work, and to people who wouldn't have been able to participate in church in any other way because they were working 7 days a week. The Methodist movement then, as the English colonies in America grew, the Methodist movement also moved to America, and Methodist societies began in the churches, in the Anglican churches in the big cities, but then they also started to spread out to communities where there were no churches. And then later they moved onto the frontier. It was said that Presbyterians built a church as soon as a community was established. The Baptists started a church as soon as people moved in, and the Methodists were there to greet them when they arrived. It's a totally apocryphal story. But anyway, the Methodists were big on spreading the Methodist movement, spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ, and they flourished in America. Do you have an understanding of what happened in 1784? Do you have an understanding of what happened in 1776? What happened in 1776? Yeah, we separated, or began our separation from the nation of England and becoming a new country in and of ourselves. So we, at the end of the Revolution, we were no longer England, and the Church of England withdrew their priests from America and called them all home. So there was no proper religion in America for a period of time, if you count the Church of England as the proper religion. John and Charles are the Wesleys and their associates by this time were greatly concerned about this, because they knew that only the ordained could give the sacraments, and the ordained had been called back to England. There were all these lay preachers, but they were not ordained. So people could hear the word, but they couldn't have the sacraments of baptism and Holy Communion. And John agonized over this, and finally made the decision that there should be a separate church, Methodist church in America. They had not yet separated as a separate church in England, but because the Church of England had cut off the former American English colonies, they became a new church. They met, the lay preachers met. John tried to get bishops to ordain some of his lay preachers for America. Unsuccessfully, the bishops in England would not cooperate. So John looked back to the New Testament and found that people had their congregations lay hands on them and ordained them in that way. So he gathered some other priests and laid hands on Francis Asbury, or on Thomas Coke, consecrated him as a superintendent. He was already an ordained pastor, but sent him to America to ordain priests, or to ordain pastors in America. One of the first of whom was ordained was Francis Asbury. You've probably heard that name, Asbury. He became the primary bishop in America, and then he in turn ordained others for service in America. So we began as a new church with the creation of the United States of America, and they organized in 1784 on Christmas Day. They had the Christmas conference in Baltimore, and they came together to organize what was called the Methodist Episcopal Church in America. Episcopal means there are bishops. The Greek word for bishop is episkopos. So if a church is episcopal, it means it has bishops. Okay? Eventually, the Church of England sent priests back to the established Church of England churches in the United States. Those churches primarily became the Protestant Episcopal Church in America, which we now just know as the Episcopal Church. So the churches with the red door that we call Episcopal churches are the successors to the Church of England churches in the United States. The Methodist Episcopal churches were organized as much as we are now. They had a general conference, which was everybody, all the churches, and then they broke up into what were called annual conferences, and those were regional areas. So I want you to turn in this just the basics package to page 4. And I'll pause for a minute and ask if there are any questions. This is the world's quickest romp through the history of the history of Methodism. But no questions. All right, you all got that right down. So when the quiz comes along, you'll be able to choose the right answers. All right, very good. Essentially, the structure that we have in the United Methodist Church now was born out of that gathering in 1784 at the Christmas conference. That was the first general conference. And from that, they came up with the discipline of the discipline of the Methodist Episcopal Church. And we still have the discipline of the United Methodist Church. Occasionally, someone in the church will throw it at you. We often pull it out when we want to prove something that we think is right. But the discipline, you see all these little earmarks in it. I was on the Board of Ordained Ministry. I was the co-chair of the Board of Ordained Ministry for many years. So I had to know what all the rules and regulations pertaining to pastors and candidates and such were. Becky Sweet's book was even more tagged than this, but because she was a district superintendent after being on the executive of the board. Anyway, the discipline is the book of rules of the church. It's written and rewritten every 4 years. The General Conference meets and proposes changes to the discipline or additions to the discipline, and those are voted on by the General Conference. So the General Conference generally meets in the same year excuse me, as presidential elections in the United States, or used to be the Summer Olympics. But right now we're in a lull because 2016 was a very contentious General Conference, and then they called for a special session to deal with issues around human sexuality. That took place in 2019, and there weren't a lot of decisions made at that conference. And then there were to be some referrals to the General Conference of 2020, and we all know what happened in March of 2020 with COVID. So the General Conference of 2020, which may have been the time when we would have either resolved these questions or come to some kind of agreement on separation of our church, it didn't happen. It was postponed for a year and then postponed again for a year. It is now scheduled for September 2022, but the chances of a worldwide gathering and people being able to get all their visas and gather safely by September 22, I don't know whether it's going to happen or not. It's still scheduled, but we don't know whether it's going to happen. But that's the General Conference. Happens every 4 years. Only the General Conference can speak for United Methodism. Only General Conference can change the laws of the church or the official positions of the church or the official expressions of the church. The bishops meet. The Council of Bishops is a mostly encouraging kind of group. The decisions that they make and the statements that they make don't have the force of law. Bishops preside at the General Conference, but they do not have any power at General Conference. They have a lot of appointive power in the annual conferences. But the General Conference is made up of representatives of every regional area, which I'll get to the annual conference, but every annual conference elects delegates to General Conference. That includes all the conferences in the United States. It includes all the conferences in Europe, in Africa, in the Philippines. So it's a worldwide gathering. There are no United Methodist churches in South America at this point, or in Australia, but we're on every other continent. And every conference sends delegates, equal numbers of lay delegates and clergy delegates to the general conference. And each person has one vote, so no one has weighted votes. The general conference is the group that, as I said, makes the decisions about the discipline. Only general conference can make changes in the discipline. So that is why those who are concerned that the United Methodist Church isn't moving forward very fast on issues of human sexuality, and whether we should ordain homosexual persons or whether we should allow churches and clergy to participate in same-gender marriage. The reason that hasn't moved forward, why there hasn't been decisions made about changes to that or a split in the church has not yet come about, it's because we haven't had the general conference. And only general conference can make these decisions. The jurisdictions are a division of the general conference. The jurisdictions only exist in the United States, and there are 5 jurisdictions: Northeastern, Southeastern, North Central, South Central, and Western jurisdictions. They function primarily to elect the bishops. The jurisdictional conference meets in the same year as the general conference and elects bishops from within the clergy of that jurisdiction. The reason for the jurisdictions are rooted in our Civil War. So the politics of the United States has a lot to do with what's happening in the Methodist movement in America. The Civil War, the lead up to the Civil War and the issue of slavery divided the Methodist Episcopal Church. At the time, there were some bishops that owned slaves, and they were loath to give up that right. This was in the 1840s. First thing that happened was that we spun off an independent denomination, the Wesleyan Church, the Wesleyan Methodist Church, so-called. Now they just go by the Wesleyan Church. Separated from the Methodist Episcopal Church because they were being too slow to stand against slavery. So Orange Scott and a number of others split off in 1840. They split off the Wesleyan Church. Shortly after that, 1844, the Methodist Episcopal Church split north and south. They could not come to agreement over whether they would be abolitionist or not. So we had the Methodist Episcopal Church in the north and the Methodist Episcopal Church South, or the Southern Methodists, as you may have heard them called, in the southeastern United States. When eventually in 1939 those two reconciled, along with the Methodist Protestant Church. And I'm not going to get into the history of the Methodist Protestant Church, but those three branches, the Methodist Protestant Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church, North and South, came together in 1939 to create what's called the Methodist Church. And most of us in our younger years grew up in the Methodist Church. No other modifiers on that, just the Methodist Church. When they came back together, those tensions in the church, north and south, were still there. And so in order to create peace, and in order so that no Southern pastor would have a Yankee bishop. That's the reality of it. So that no Southern annual conference would have a Yankee bishop imposed upon them. The jurisdictions were created so that all the southeastern churches and all the southeastern annual conferences would only have bishops elected from the southeastern United States. And in the same way in the northeast, and eventually in the northern Midwest and the southern Midwest, and then the western jurisdiction. There's many fewer churches west of the Mississippi. The western jurisdiction basically begins just this side of the Rocky Mountains. But the Methodist movement sort of lost steam. They lost their evangelical zeal in the middle of the 1800s. So about the time when big westward expansion was happening in the United States, the Methodist movement had become settled, basically, and they didn't send their missionaries out west with all the people who moved west. Other churches did. The Disciples of Christ, notably the Disciples of Christ, or the so-called Christian church. There are many more. They sort of fill the niche that the United Methodist Church fills in the East. So that's why the jurisdictions were created after the merger in 1939 to allow for the tensions that were still there between the North and the South. In addition to that, at that time, in the 1940s, they created what were called central conferences. Now, those are different than the central conferences that exist today. The jurisdictional conferences, the annual conferences, are all regional. They're all defined by geographic boundaries. The central conferences were defined by race. They were the black churches within an annual conference. And in our area, the Washington Conference was the Black Central Conference that extended over several annual conferences in the Northeast. So all the black churches were lumped into racial central conferences. Those that doesn't count the denominations that were primarily African American churches that had grown up starting in the early 1800s, the 1800 numbers, and continued to exist up to the last of the big African American splits was that the Methodist Episcopal Church South spun off their primarily black churches to what was called the CME Church. At the time, it was called the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, now called the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, or the CME. Those are separate from United Methodism. But the central conferences were the African American churches within the Methodist Church in this merger of 1939. They were administered separately from the white churches. That ended in 1968 when the United Methodist Church was created. But for many years we lived with that legacy. The Central Conference as it exists now, a Central Conference is essentially a jurisdiction, but outside the United States. There are several jurisdictions in Europe. There are several jurisdictions, or central conferences in Europe, and there are several central conferences in Africa. There's the Philippines Central Conference. So anything outside the United States, it's a gathering of annual conferences outside the United States. Have I totally confused you yet? No. Good. Okay. Great. So we have gotten down on page 4 here, we're down to annual conference. How often does an annual conference meet, do you suppose? Annually. There you go. It's called an annual conference because it does meet annually, but it's also a geographic region. We began in this area as the Genesee Conference, and the Genesee Conference extended from Wellsboro, Pennsylvania, south of Corning, to Detroit, well, from your perspective, Pennsylvania to Detroit, and then to Quebec City, big triangle. That was the Genesee Conference as it was first conceived in 1810, right? I believe 1810. We were founded. It gradually shrunk. The War of 1812 kind of separated us from Canada, which was still part of England, and so the Upper Canada District and the Lower Canada District, upper and lower were with regard to elevation. The Upper Canada was the Detroit area, was Canada, southern Ontario, but up above the Great Lakes. Lower Canada was down where the St. Lawrence flowed out. So Quebec is Lower Canada. I'm reversing I'm looking at my map in front of me. It's actually flowing this way. Anyway, Canada left. We gradually consolidated. We got smaller and smaller. We became the Western New York Conference in this area, which extended essentially from the Pennsylvania line down Ripley, and if you dropped a plumb line from the east side of the eastern suburbs or immediate exurbs of Rochester straight down, that was the Western New York Conference. It was a small geographic conference. There were lots of churches in it, and it was still called the Genesee Conference for many years, and eventually the Western New York Conference. In 2010, we merged with the North Central New York Conference, which was already a merger of the Northern New York and Central New York Conferences. The New York churches of the Troy Conference, which also included Vermont at one time, so we split the Troy Conference down the middle, and the New York churches of the Wyoming Conference, which was partly in the southern tier of New York and partly in Pennsylvania. Down, if you've traveled Route 15, that's the old Wyoming Conference, now called the Susquehanna Conference. The New York churches of that, all those churches merged together to become the Upper New York Conference. So now the Upper New York Conference is everything in New York State north of the Catskills, and then New York City and Long Island. Those are all the New York Conference. We are the Upper New York Conference. And it's been a little bit tough for those of us who participate in the conference. It's been hard because we were a small group, we were regional. I served churches all over the conference, but I moved from Marilla, which is in Erie County, to Penfield, we lived in Penfield, and I was pastor in Macedon Center and South Parrington, which were the last churches on the eastern edge of the conference, but it was, an hour and 15, 20 minutes across. Now, we are a very large, it feels like very large annual conference. So it's been a little bit taxing. The leader, the clergy leader of a conference is a bishop. So we continue to be an Episcopal church, even though we've dropped the Episcopal part of the name out of our name. We are still Episcopal in our what is called polity. And our bishop is, do you know our bishop's name? Mark Webb is our bishop, right? It's there in front of you if you were reading along with me. In order to administer more efficiently, they have the annual conferences are divided up into districts. And our districts have, the lines of the districts have changed over the years. Western New York at one time had 5 districts, and around 2004, we eliminated the Batavia district, which was between the Buffalo district and the Rochester district, and divided it in half and sent some churches to the Buffalo district and some to the Rochester district, which were renamed according to markers in their geographical area. So this area, this district where we are, became the Niagara Frontier District. And it basically covers all of Erie County, Niagara County, a lot of Genesee County, a little bit of Orleans County, Wyoming County. So we're the north, from your perspective, the northwest district in our conference. And I'm not going to try and name all the rest of the 12 districts. We have 9 district superintendents over our 12 districts. So there are some overlapping responsibilities of the DS. But our district superintendent is Reverend Carlos Rosalaguer, and he has been district superintendent, 3 or 4 years. Usually the bishops serve 4-year terms, and they often serve 2, and they can be allowed for missional purposes to serve 12 years as a bishop of an annual conference. Or sometimes they have 2 conferences. That's getting rarer and rarer. District superintendents serve anywhere from 6 years to 8 years. Sometimes they choose to go back to the church or to the local church or retire after 5 years or fewer. Don Weaver was a district superintendent. Many of the pastors of this congregation have either been before they were pastor here or after they were pastor here, became district superintendents. Gene Ferguson, Vern Bigler, Don Weaver, Becky Sweet, Bob Pasco. All of them had either been immediately before they became pastor here or immediately after became district superintendents. My wife, Kathy, was a district superintendent, but I was not. I was spared that appointment. Within the districts, the next division down is a charge. We don't use the term charge very often, but especially in a one church charge like this is. A charge is all the churches served by a single pastor or a single team of pastors. So you might have a 2 or 3 point charge that a pastor served. I have served twice. I have served 2 point charges where you had 2 churches that functioned as one administrative body. so we talked about the charge. So my charge was the church, all the churches that I serve. And they often have a joint charge conference. They have a joint staff parish relations committee. So that is the charge. And then under the charge is the single local church. And we are, the Kenmore United Methodist Church is a charge in itself. We are one local church served by, actually we have more than one pastor. We've had 3, and now we have 2 on staff, paid staff pastors, and several retired pastors who attend here, as you know. So that's the basic structure of the United Methodist Church. Any questions at this point? Some of this may be totally review for you. Some of it might be completely confusing or new to you. Okay. So that's my. I encourage you to read this. It's just the basics is written for 7th graders, so many of you might be able to understand it. We will get into the questions of how, what this structure means for today next time, okay? In your book, in your package, I encourage you to read the social principles and particularly the nurturing community, which is the 3rd group, I believe. I'll tell you what page it begins on. It's after the social community. Humbug. Just a minute. Page 4, the nurturing community. Okay, that is the part that we're dealing with that is that has human sexuality in it. It's the 7th part of that section. So it begins on page 4 and 5, and continues on. I encourage you to read that and to read through the at least the summary and FAQs on the protocol for separation if you're at all interested in that. Thank you. If you want to turn your folder back in, you can. You don't have to. You're welcome to keep it. It's hard to read through it if you don't have it with you. And you may want to look at the Global Methodist Church, which is the last piece of paper in there, about what is the Global Methodist Church, what do they stand for. And I say they. I am not affiliated in any way with them, nor will I be affiliated with them. But it is the largest and most organized traditionalist church that will probably become a church out of this, if we do in fact separate. So, go in peace.
We each get a piece of candy for attendance. No, I'm only kidding.
I came in late because of coffee, so could I have a folder? Thank you. Oh my gosh, my husband.
I know, I killed a lot of trees. Sorry.
No, that's good. That's good, thank you.
You're welcome.
That was one of the best determinations of all descriptions.
Well, thank you.
Great. Did a good job.
So, if we separate, will we be the global, or will we